So my name is Courtney Schultz. I'm a professor at Colorado State University, and I'm presenting today with Heidi Huber-Stearns. This is a joint fire science program project, and I'm the PI, and we have co-PIs at the University of Oregon, and Heidi's a researcher on the project as well, and covered all our interviews for Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. So she's going to be here to answer questions at the end, specific to those states, because she knows more about them than I do. So to give you a quick overview of our project, as you guys all showed in the poll, most people are really trying to increase their application of prescribed fire. We just did a bunch of research on the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. People told us that the one thing they couldn't really get done was their prescribed fire consistently. And we see a lot of stuff in the literature about the need to get more fire on the landscape. So this is something I've been interested in for quite a while. And in 2016, there was a joint fire science program call specifically to look at policy barriers to prescribed fire and social barriers. Because I study policy, I wanted to focus on those. And the survey work on this and the knowledge about it is a little bit patchy. There's been some survey in different regions that have been great. There haven't been as many nationwide looks at this question recently. There was a survey back in 2000 where people essentially checked boxes and said that air quality regulation, NEPA, and the ESA were their primary barriers to doing more prescribed fire. So what we really wanted to do was look into those in a little bit more detail. So we don't know when someone checks a box for like the Clean Air Act, if it's a problem with the law that needs revising, if it's the way it's being implemented at the state level, if it's something about local discretion or agency policy. So what we decided to do was really dig into this and look a little bit more qualitatively at where the actual barriers are, and then try to figure out which ones actually can be changed in some way. So where we might have lever points to overcome some of these barriers. And achieving policy change is going to look differently whether or not we're looking at congressional law versus agency regulation or practice. So that was our goal with this project, to identify the most significant policy barriers and priorities for change, figure out the opportunities and mechanisms for overcoming those. And I should clarify that this was focused on Forest Service and BLM lands, so we're not as focused on private landowners, although we could talk a little bit about that because people are doing cross-boundary burning, so it's something that comes up. Our project had 4 major tasks. So we did a legal analysis of all the state implementation plans and smoke management plans for the 11 Western states. And that's in a report. I'll share that link with you all at the end. We're working on a spatial analysis where we're looking at the occurrence of prescribed fires on Forest Service and BLM lands, and then to the extent to which they correlate with weather and air quality variables. So that's in progress. We did interviews across the West. That's what I'm going to talk about today. And then we're following this up with case studies, which we're just starting now. And our project has a lot of policy and science delivery. So we've already spent a bunch of time on the Hill and with agency leadership, sharing our findings and try to inform the conversation around this. So today what I'm going to focus on is just phase 1 of our project, really the first 2 years, where we did our legal analysis and our interviews across the West. So our interviews, we did about 60 interviews in 11 Western states. We did about 5 or 6 in each one. And each state, what we did was we tried to target somebody with the environmental quality agencies, so state DEQs, and we were usually talking to someone in their air quality control division. We also wanted to talk with someone pretty high level with the Forest Service and BLM, so people like BLM state fuels leads or Forest Service fuels program managers or smoke liaisons. Sometimes we talk to people more at the field level, but that's really more for our case studies. Then we also talked to key partners with state forestry agencies because they're so critical to this issue and they work together so much with the federal land managers, and then prescribed fire councils where they exist. And sometimes other key partners where interviewees said we needed to talk to them. So our goals with these interviews are to kind of get a broad brush across the West about the primary barriers to doing more prescribed fire, the actionable opportunities to increase application of fire. And we weren't really doing case studies on these states, so I will talk about state-by-state information, but really our goal here was to get a picture of what's going on West-wide and what are the diversity of approaches and challenges people are facing. So today, since air quality's come up in the literature as one of the biggest barriers, and there have been a lot of recommendations for changing Clean Air Act regulations or the law itself, I'm going to focus on that first, and then we're going to talk about other common barriers and hopefully have a little bit of time for questions and discussion. So some general findings for us on air quality, we focused on this pretty heavily in our interviews. People said it's a constraint, but for the most part, they said it's not their primary barrier. This was particularly true in the Intermountain West, and it came out loud and clear as a theme in our work. Where this is different is in Washington and Oregon. And so what we heard was that the smoke management plans in the Pacific Northwest were more restrictive. The plans themselves, but also the ways that they're implemented are more restrictive. And some of this has to do with topography in the PNW. There's more populations in valleys where smoke might aggregate after a fire event. And so that's a part of this. In other states, we heard that this was not really the primary issue that people wanted to address. They said it interacts with other hurdles, and it's particularly a challenge for doing multi-day landscape burning because that can be hard to regulate and hard to forecast for. But we did hear a lot of people say, I'll finally get all my capacity in place, all my NEPA done, everything else I need to do, and then I can't get my permit on the day I actually have a burn window and everyone lined up. And so I think part of what happens is that people will say, all right, therefore air quality is the barrier. But then when, people would talk through it, they'd say there's actually so many days we're good to go on air quality, but we can't line up the capacity or the funding or something else. So that's going to come out as a big theme in our work. Another thing that was really interesting is that no one suggested there was a need for changes to federal law at this time. And no one suggested that prescribed fire smoke just shouldn't be regulated. They all appreciated the role of regulation and said that it was really critical to have air quality agencies and people focused on human health in this equation. In general, people said other factors, even where air quality was maybe a challenge, they said other things were higher priorities to address. There was room to grow their programs in other ways, and that's where they were focusing their energy. So just to give you an example of what this looked like in people's own words, and we have like 20 quotes like this in our report that we shared just so you can see what people said, but one person said, "We've worked really hard to communicate and build relationships with air quality folks in Arizona and New Mexico. I think a lot of other things come into play before air quality does to keep us from implementing prescribed burns." Another person said the law doesn't impede burning so much as some of the more practical realities on the ground. You don't have enough money, people, or there's too much fire danger. So we heard this over and over again, and sort of this notion that sometimes air quality maybe gets scapegoated. So this was really interesting. I wanted to share some approaches in different states because if you're really familiar with one or two states, you might not know the diversity of permitting and communication and coordination approaches across the West, and there's a lot of interesting lessons to be learned. So Montana, all the major open burners, including the Forest Service and the BLM, get a single air quality permit for the whole season. And so they really rely on a lot of day-to-day communication between the land managers and DEQs. But there's not like permitting by burn plan like we see in Colorado. So much more flexible regulatory structure in terms of the formal law in Montana. And then there's a Montana-Idaho airshed group. And so this is a group that people characterize as being built by the burners and for the burners. And so it's really a burners group that tracks burn requests. They have online data from about burn requests that Air Sciences, Inc. manages. And they're essentially this group of burners with a chair that's a rotating chair, and they meet a couple times a year to identify their issues, to set up for communication with DEQ. But what they do is they look at who wants to burn in the airshed, what are their constraints, and then they're trying to coordinate that competition within an airshed for burn days. And then they communicate on behalf of the burners with DEQ so that individual burn bosses don't have to. So that's a really interesting kind of example because people point to this as a pretty successful model. One of the key takeaways I'm going to come back to over and over is that these coordination groups that coordinate among burners and then have really institutionalized structures to communicate with DEQs are really important for finding the opportunities for understanding each other's concerns and then looking at how to limit regulatory burden or work within those constraints. And I'm not saying everything's peaches and cream in Montana. There's definitely local challenges in places with inversions and more county level restrictions, but I think some interesting lessons to be learned here. In Oregon, ODF works on behalf of Oregon DEQ to handle the permitting. So that's interesting because it adds another agency to the mix with a different mission that's involved in this whole arena. And their smoke management plans in Oregon, they aim to limit intrusions of smoke into smoke sensitive areas. So these are really towns. And they're typically trying to regulate to standards that are stricter than what the Clean Air Act would require. So the Clean Air Act might have a 24-hour standard and an annual standard for a certain pollutant. These are the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. And then what we heard in Oregon is that the states in Oregon and Washington will try to limit intrusions at even more strict levels, like maybe not exceeding that standard for an hour or a couple hours in those towns. So more of a desire to keep smoke out of those areas. But we're also seeing revisions of those smoke management plans. And I think the idea here from what I understand, and this is something Heidi can talk more about later, is that they're trying to decrease the specific legal requirements in the smoke management plans to create a little bit more room for flexibility on the ground. Most people said they'd like a little bit more flexibility on intrusions. Sorry, hold on a sec. You know, to work with regulators on having a little more flexibility around those intrusions to be able to burn more. So in New Mexico, there's a totally different permitting approach. It's a permit by rule system, which is essentially a process where you have to register your burns, and then there's requirements with which burners must comply. And some interesting things I think from New Mexico and Region 3 of the Forest Service in general is that there's a dedicated air quality liaison in the Forest Service for both New Mexico and Arizona. This was originally the first example of this was in Arizona, and it was co-funded by the Arizona DEQ and the Forest Service, and that person actually sat at the DEQ and really built that communication across agencies to find opportunities. And the DOI agencies have a similar liaison to the smoke committees and to DEQ in New Mexico. So again, that active communication and dedicated positions are really critical. One thing we heard in New Mexico that I think is interesting is this gray area around managing natural ignitions. And this is something we heard in a few states, that if land managers kind of avoid the discussion with regulators around smoke around natural ignitions, then this might lead to some challenges in the future. So I think keeping that active communication and dialogue is going to be really important. In Colorado, burners have to obtain a permit for every burn plan. It essentially will tell you how many acres you can burn at different ventilation ventilation levels. And there is a smoke manual that basically says how these different acreages will be identified in these permits. But there's also the possibility for non-standard permits. And so we're seeing more of this lately in Colorado, where the APCD is allowing burning more into the evening or under different conditions than maybe are identified in the smoke manual. And again, that relies on really active measurement of conditions, putting out monitors and active communication with DEQ to find that space to do these non-standard permits. So I think conditions are changing here around air quality permitting in Colorado, something we could talk more about. And then the Forest Service here is investing in smoke management positions at the regional office and convening stakeholders to really diagnose problems and think about solutions and next steps. California is a little different. There are 35 air quality districts overseen by the California Air Resources Board, and those districts handle permitting. People definitely said air quality is a major consideration in some places. They tell us about the San Joaquin Valley and say, you know, there's an airshed with a ton of competition in it, but even there they would say air quality regulation is not our biggest barrier. You know, they'd say we need more monitoring, we need better meteorological data, we need to keep working with the air quality districts to find the space to burn. But even there, even in California, this is not what people pointed to. And there's actually been I think I just heard recently, a big commitment on the part of CARB to increase burning. And sometimes there's this misperception that the California Smoke Management Plan requires a stricter standard than what the Clean Air Act does, and that's not something that interviewees indicated either. Some cool stuff is happening in California. There's a fire MOU partnership, which is really this group of land managers, state forestry, NGO partners, all at the table. And really what they're doing is trying to kind of answer the same questions we're looking at, which is why are we not getting more fire on the ground and how do we do it? So this is really interesting because a lot of times people don't actually know what the barrier is, right? So the regional office here has been asking people to document when you're burning or you're not burning on days that are good to go from an air quality perspective. Why is that happening? And they're trying to gather more information. I talked to someone from the MOU partnership who said, we have all these good burn days in April, we don't use them, you know, and we're finding out it has to do with personnel and training and things like that. So I think this is a really critical lesson, is that these state level partnerships are essential for accurately diagnosing the problem and figuring out what the solutions are. People also told us that they have some good improving relationships with CAL FIRE, and I think the state legislature just approved significant funding to build up teams at the state level, and then those teams will be burning also on federal land. So that's a really critical improvement there. So some other details. There is state level variation in the way the Clean Air Act is implemented, and that can matter, but it's also important to pay attention to these systems of coordination and problem solving that people have in place. I think that's some of the most important variation we saw. And another thing I wanted to mention is that people in the literature have recommended that maybe prescribed fire be treated like an exceptional event so that it doesn't basically count towards whether or not you're in attainment or not under the Clean Air Act. And that is not possible without legislative change, and that's not something that anyone recommended. So we could talk more about that if you're interested in that, but I'll just leave it there for now. And I just wanted to wrap up with this quote about smoke. One person said it's about communicating and not regulating. It's that direct dialogue that's kept the regulations flexible and responsive to what the burners need to do. Just as some final conclusions, I think as much as we want sort of a silver bullet policy change, I don't think we've identified anything here that really would be that silver bullet. What we really need is more close communication among burners and then between the regulators and the land managers. That seems to be the recipe for success. Investing in better monitoring and better data, training prescribed fire personnel in smoke management and outreach, and really building it into their ethos as part of their jobs. And we have prescribed fire, FMOs tell us that. And then some things on the horizon. Multi-day burning is definitely a challenge. Regulations around natural ignitions is going to be a challenge. PM 2.5 standards have consistently gotten stricter over time, and people see that on the horizon. And then these smoke management plan revisions in Oregon and Washington, I think, will be significant. So the most common barriers, this is what people said was actually getting in their way for burning in almost all places. And even in places where they said air quality regulation is a challenge, they also pointed to this stuff. The biggest thing people told us, I kind of organized this in like most common to the less common themes, but they said they don't have capacity during burn windows because they lose their personnel to wildland firefighting. And so they said that it's, fire season's getting longer and longer. And so almost anywhere you are, we have a burn window to do prescribed fire, people are getting pulled onto wildland fire. And there's incentives, there's financial incentives for fire personnel to do that, but it also can have to do with regional and national leadership wanting to hold resources so they're available and not wanting to make them available for prescribed fire. So that can also be an issue. And then we also heard a lot of issues around loss of seasonal staff. If you've got great burn windows in the fall, that can be an issue. Or when you're onboarding people in the spring, it can be an issue. Having people not available because they're on training was a big frustration. And then sometimes even holiday leave can be an issue. Another capacity issue we heard about is that no one has what they need, the resources and the personnel to burn without partnering with local wildland fire departments, state agencies, and across the federal agencies. And so they said, we need staff for agreements. We need people who are really adept at this stuff in order to get the capacity we need. And another capacity issue was fire personnel and ID teams. So when I asked people, is NEPA a barrier? They would say it's not really the law. It's like the bad NEPA that someone wrote 7 years ago that I don't like, and I don't think it sets me up for burning. And so they would say, we need, fire is such a big issue. We need to have fire personnel on ID teams consistently. People also said they have a lack of dollars for implementation. And we definitely heard this from the BLM. This sort of like if you were a sage grouse state, you weren't burning because you had sage grouse. And if you weren't a sage grouse state, you weren't burning as much because there wasn't as much money. So I think that was a big issue in some of the BLM interviewees. But also we heard this consistently with the Forest Service that they just need more money to get this work done, and that money gets pulled to mechanical thinning, both to meet targets, but also because you can be sure you're going to get it done in a certain fiscal year. Resource sharing came up as a huge theme. So people said that they need more capacity and more efficiency to enter into agreements. So, I talked to one person who said that their unit had an outgoing agreement with the local Park Service unit and an incoming agreement, and they were on different timelines and they have to be tracked. And so if you imagine all these units across the system having all of these different agreements to share resources, that could start to seem kind of inefficient and like a huge workload. So people said they need staff for agreements, they need consistent legal advice, and they need more efficiency. One person said, if we could charge to a single P code to share BLM and Forest Service resources the way we could do wildland fire, that would be the single biggest breakthrough that would allow us to do more prescribed fire. And that's actually something that would take agency change and wouldn't take legislative or appropriations law change. So it comes with issues, but something that came up pretty consistently in our interviews. And then sadly, we found out the GAO has been bringing it up for 30 years. So we weren't finding out anything new. So there are some cool things happening. There's joint powers masters agreements where states and federal agencies are in statewide agreements to share resources. there are some more regional agreements that are being undertaken. But people said we need more opportunities for nimble resource sharing. And there are some good things going on, especially when you can partner with your state agencies. But people said that if your state agencies don't have capacity or aren't into prescribed fire, then that can be a real challenge. We also heard that local partners like Forest Stewards Guild, Nature Conservancy, and Treks make a huge difference for people in terms of whether or not they can staff up a burn team when they need to. Some other common barriers, people said there aren't a lot of internal incentives to burn. I think this is changing, particularly with the Forest Service and the way that they're structuring performance measures and targets. This is something we could come back to, but we heard this pretty consistently in our interviews. And then people would say there's a lot of risk aversion at different levels. And if your line officers and your burn bosses aren't committed, there's a lot of things they can point to as to why they're not burning or reasons to not burn. So over and over, we heard quotes like this. One person said, I really don't think there's a lot of incentive to do prescribed fire. The incentive comes from the agency administrator and burn boss passion for doing what's right on the landscape. And this is a huge theme in all of our interviews, and even in our recent case study on the San Juan, people said if the line officers are committed to fire and the FMOs are committed to fire, they find a way. And we heard that quote, where there's a will, there's a way, pretty frequently. There are some unique initiatives in place. Region 3's pooling targets and personnel across multiple forests. There's a 1 Million Acre Forest Supervisors Challenge in Utah. Montana, they told us the BLM's planning, 5-year strategies around watersheds for burning. So I think some cool, innovative stuff happening out there. We definitely heard that media coverage and political attention on escape, prescribed fire, extreme wildland fire events can be an issue. So we often heard at the local level with line officers and FMOs, the risk aversion is more kind of personal liability and local publics, but it can be a little bit more the political and media attention at regional or state levels. One thing people told us is that collaborators, when they've been really engaged, get out in front of the public and support the Forest Service when they're burning, and that can be really awesome. And that also active media outreach with journalists can be really helpful, and then engaging with DEQ personnel early and often is a key to success. Some other challenges that came up, short burn windows, particularly on some forests, burn windows that are right during the height of the fire season on some forests. This is a huge challenge. Field types and topography for sure. I mentioned sage grouse, but I don't think species conservation came up as a huge barrier in other situations. Definitely the presence of cheatgrass is making a lot of people, particularly in the Great Basin states, not want to burn. And then we heard a little bit about drought. So one person said, essentially I haven't come into prescription to a point where I would want to light prescribed fire for a while because of drought conditions. To kind of sum this up, one person said, I think it's all the different regulations on the landscape, trying to find the perfect time when you're in prescription, the weather's right, you're in the right place at the right time, the owls, bugs, and salamanders are happy, and then third on the list is smoke management. And so you can see you kind of just have to line up a lot of things, and you have to be really motivated to get the work done. So some general recommendations that came out of our set of interviews here. One is that there's not a real clear indication that there's a need for national policy change at this time. Maybe in Oregon and Washington at the smoke management plans, we heard this. Maybe to support better resource sharing and capacity, I'll come back to that. And then potentially to create a little bit more flexibility to burn on private land. We heard this from particularly some BLM folks because the Forest Service, I think, has a little more legal authority to do that right now. People said communication and local problem solving are critical. So one thing I've been really thinking about is that for fire, you have to collaborate at the state level. It makes sense because of the way air quality works, because of the role of state forestry agencies. But you also have to have that local level collaboration for your public communication and acceptance and building agreement around projects. And then also finding personnel. One thing that's really interesting is that when I asked people, do you need more categorical exclusions? What do you think about NEPA? People said, we have Cat X's for smaller projects in the WUI, but they often said that what they're trying to do is more district-wide EAs. We just saw the San Juan do this on the Dolores Ranger District to get more stuff cleared through NEPA more quickly. And they also said that the EA process is critical for building agreement with partners and doing the public communication that are all essential to getting prescribed fire done. So I thought that was interesting. but I've digressed. Let's go back. So improving leadership and incentives, figuring out better options for streamlining agreements, processes. I think addressing the capacity challenge potentially through some dedicated burn teams would be helpful. And then doing more creative outreach and use of collaborative partners is obviously critical to success where we see it. Some other observations, I think there's an opportunity to get significantly more work done with some internal agency problem solving and more funding, which is great news, right? If we were talking about like having to rewrite the Clean Air Act, it'd be a much sadder story in terms of our prospects for getting more fire on the ground. So I've talked to people who say they feel like the agencies are kind of a watershed moment in terms of potentially getting more work done. We're seeing, like I said, some innovative approaches to planning and scaling up. And as I mentioned, I think that role of local and state level collaboration is pretty critical for this and other issues related to fire management. When we talk about land use planning or restoration project planning, this comes back as a major theme. I think finding more room to maneuver on air quality is still critical. We just want to be careful about making sure we have empirical data that this is the problem and figuring out where the potential policy options are. Because, you know, changing human health regulation is not something that most people recommend, and it is a really serious thing to consider. I just wanted to finish up by sharing a few things I've heard from policymakers at the national level. So I've definitely heard a lot of interest in creating more dedicated capacity, regional teams, state level teams, or interagency teams, and trying to figure out how to keep people who actually would be dedicated to burning in place. There's definitely conversation around changing targets and improving leadership around getting more fire on the ground. One thing I've heard about on the Hill is the notion that maybe we could create a pool of money that communities could compete for and essentially say we have the agreements in place, we have the NEPA done, we have the social agreement, you know, could we get the money to do more prescribed fire? Also internally, I think emphasizing the needs for fuels organizations on management units and then fire ecologists on ID teams is something that could come up. And when we've talked to people on the Hill, this is something that I think would not necessarily be a legislative approach, but something that would come up more through an oversight process or oversight hearings. And then I'll just finish by saying, you know, the major policy proposal that's out there right now is to expand categorical exclusions. This is in the House version of the Farm Bill to create more 6,000 acre categorical exclusions. And I think this is interesting for us collectively as a community to think about, that the narrative right now associated with that bill is that the answer is, you know, that NEPA is the problem and the answer is more categorical exclusions and more active management. And so we want to think about alternative narratives that also might be interesting to consider, like how to get more fire on the ground and more capacity and more local collaboration, because those are a lot of the challenges that and opportunities that we find in our work. So, got to regain control. Thanks for listening to me. I know it's been a lot of information all at once. I want to thank the Joint Fire Science Program for funding this work. We've got a couple years left, 700 days, I think I recently counted. Not that I'm nervous about getting everything done. And also thank my other research team members. Cass Mosley is my co-PI at the University of Oregon, and Doug Quirk did our legal analysis at the law school. Sarah McCaffrey's been working with us, and Gwen Rico was a grad student with me who worked on this as well, in addition to Heidi, who's on the phone and can now help us answer questions.
Great, thanks, Courtney. Yeah, go ahead and turn on your camera, Heidi, if you feel like it, and unmute yourself. We have about 8 questions right now that are open, and so I'm going to ask you, Courtney, to stop sharing your screen. And if you don't know how to do that, I can help walk you through that.
Gloria, do it.
Okay. And in the meantime, I'm going to launch one more poll, which we wanted to understand. Second. That's not the question. Sorry, guys.
That's the poll we already did.
Yeah. Today's day of technological difficulties, apparently.
Would you like me to go ahead and start a couple questions?
Yeah, go ahead and do that, and then I will figure out. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, go ahead and start on the questions.
Okay. One comment was, it appears that you have possibly omitted tribes from, oh, see, no, it moved.
From your burner regulator entities, as well as from
Yes.
your representation list as callers in. Can you
Oh.
address that?
Here we are. It appears you omitted tribes from your burner regulated entities as well as your representation list as callers in. Any contact with tribes?
Yeah, so we did not reach out to tribes in this original kind of big picture look because we were so focused on federal lands, but I agree that it's an omission. So it's something that we are trying to remedy now with our case studies. Heidi, I don't know if you have had a different experience in your interviews, but no, it's not a group that we prioritized in these interviews.
No, I would say there's a couple in our report. There's a couple mentions of tribes in Nevada and Utah specifically with some of the interviews that we did and some of the linkages to those. And I'm going to actually put those links to our report in the chat box in case folks want to look at that.
That's a good idea. They can easily grab those links. Julie just had a comment. Your research results match perfectly with what we are experiencing in North Central Idaho. It's good to see the actual problems limiting prescribed burning being more clearly identified.
Thanks, that's good to hear.
Chris Chambers had a question. How common are private contractors used for burning? This sounds like it's primarily a public agency capacity issue. Private companies can potentially bridge many of the shortcomings that you've discussed.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I just have kind of a little bit of information on that, but I think it's something else that we want to look into more in our case studies, but it's not something that interviewees raised a lot. They raised much more the issue of doing cross-boundary burning with private landowners. I did just have a private contractor contact me and essentially say that the bonding and insurance requirements to burn on federal lands were prohibitive. And I don't know if that's common, but I think it's something that we want to look into more when we get into our case studies.
Great. I'm going to read the next question from Alex. Personnel liability is an issue that has come up in private conversations that he's had with Forest Service burn bosses in California, especially the impression that agency higher-ups wouldn't have their backs. How prevalent was this attitude in your research? Is there any evidence or examples of burn bosses being held personally responsible for escapes or accidents?
I can't answer the last part of that. I don't have information on that and I haven't looked into it. What it did come up a fair bit, and we hear it more from Forest Service personnel than we do from BLM personnel, that they're concerned about whether or not they'll be covered by the agency in terms of liability. And most FMOs that I know that are actively burning carry private liability insurance, particularly to cover themselves when they feel like they might have a gap in the coverage and support that's going to come from the federal agency. But I will say that most people say, as long as you're working within your area of responsibility and doing what your burn plan said, they feel comfortable that the agency will have their back.
And you probably mentioned this, but how many people did you interview?
I don't have that right here, but I think it's a little bit over 60. It's right around 60.
Okay. Somebody asked, did any of the managers mention wildland fire modules? They meet many of the needs that you described, but they're being phased out.
Yeah, so people did not in these set of interviews, but we just were down on the San Juan talking to both the National Forest down there, and then the BLM folks out of the Trace Rios district. And there is there's a wildland fire use module, I think the Uniweep module, that's one of the original DOI modules. And people did talk about their value in being on site and having a specific mandate to work on fuels to prep for fire when they're not burning and to be available for fire when they are burning. So that's something that, we're not quite done gathering that information in that area. So I'm looking into it, but I think it's an interesting idea. I did just ask someone higher up at the Washington office about dedicated prescribed fire teams internally. And I think there's some discussion around it, but I think more to be had and more problem solving to be done there.
All right. Rebecca had a question. Did you ask any questions on whether targets are being met with burns? I had seen a study in Arizona forest this year indicating that while they are increasing acres, a lot of the acres being prescribed burn are not being as effective as hoped. I think that a lot has to do with all of the items that have been lined up to lined up to even enable burning, then maybe the fuel and weather conditions aren't quite what is needed for the ecological work.
Yeah, so I'm not totally sure if I've got the question here, but I think we hear most people say they're meeting their fuels acres treated targets, but it's a little bit of a changing dynamic, because the question of whether or not you can count acres burned under natural ignitions towards your fuels acres treated is changing. And what we're hearing is that at the local level, people are not counting those anymore, and they're counting acres that they're treating through mechanical thinning and prescribed fire. So I think that whole thing is a moving target right now. And I think the agencies are working on, and I'm not as clear, I think I heard more disparate information when I talked to BLM folks about how their targets are working. So I'm not as clear on that, but for the most part, people said they're meeting their targets. Sometimes they're pooling targets across forests to enable them to do that. And then sometimes people said, well, we're meeting our targets through wildland fires that are burning, but I think that's recently changed.
Great. We have about 250 people still joining us today, and 100 people haven't taken that quick poll that Courtney and Heidi created. So if you could take a quick minute to let her know what's your top priority for follow-up research, and what do you think is the most important need for policy change. That information is going to help inform their research and potential future work. And then their next two questions were the same asked by Matthew and Rob. So any information regarding a public outreach and identifying the need for social licensing as a barrier to people?
Yeah, so Rob, thanks for that question. Generally what people told us is if you talk to the public and explain to them what you're doing, that they are supportive, that sometimes they want you to take a break if you're, putting smoke in an area for multiple days in a row. But that was not a big, social acceptability was not a big issue that came up. What people told us is if we communicate actively with our NGO partners and they're hosting meetings around prescribed fire and its importance, that the public is generally supportive. I think there are some places where you have more vulnerable communities, where you have more retirees, more people who've actually moved there because they have respiratory health problems. And that is more of a challenge. And in those places, people said that prescribed fire folks kind of need to be better trained into how to do smoke management outreach and work with DEQ on that, and learn from, I think, what the Wildland Fire Organization is doing around that as well, to maybe build smoke management more into their capacity and their ethos and their training. But not a huge theme that came up in our work overall.
I would add that we did hear it quite a bit in Oregon and Washington as it relates to revisions to the smoke management plan. So those revisions being an opportunity to conduct more targeted outreach. In some cases, it's kind of an explicit goal of the smoke management plan revisions that they're doing as well. So at least in the Pacific Northwest, it came up a bit, but mostly in context of the revisions that they're making with the plan.
Should we see if anyone in the room has questions?
Yeah. Sure. I don't know how many people are joining you today.
3,000. Yeah. There's 4 people here.
They've been very settled.
Yeah.
So,
let us know if you guys have any questions.
If you have any questions,
we can chat
we'll repeat
afterwards.
them up here.
Question?
Yeah.
Where are you doing your case studies?
Oh, okay. So Patty Champs here just asked where we're doing our case studies. So we're looking for places that have complex situations, so we're trying not to look at really low population areas where the regulatory context might be pretty straightforward. So we want some complexity, and then places that we have some information that they're getting more fire on the ground. And so we started with the San Juan because we heard that pretty consistently from folks in Region 2 and from BLM staff in Colorado. I think we had folks from the Socorro BLM district outside of Albuquerque reach out to us and say, hey, we're one of the few places that's doing this, so we're going to spend some time down there. And while we're down there, look at the Cibola National Forest as well, and the way that they're pooling targets with other national forests and capacity, because we've had the RO down there tell us that they're getting more fire on the ground. So that's an exciting area. We definitely want to look at the Southern Sierras. People in California pointed us to that consistently. We're still trying to figure out where we're going to go in Oregon. And we're open to ideas since we're just getting started on this. If you all know of units that you think are doing creative things and getting more fire on the ground and have lessons learned that could be shared broadly across the land management agencies, I would love to hear about them. Please email me. or just type it in a chat box.
Courtney, I shared the results of the poll there. So it should be on your screen. But the top priority seems to be we need more research on how to support letting more wildfires burn.
Yeah, I agree. So I think that there's a project that maybe Andy Thode is leading on that, or there's a piece of that funded on the Joint Fire Science Program. But I agree, a huge question. And I mean, we got into it with this research, but I think it could really benefit with some real targeted research. Yeah, and all of these are great ideas. I really appreciate being able to look at this. And this is a good reminder for us to all keep the push up for Joint Fire Science funding, because I think that's one of the places that actually afforded funding to do this kind of work.
Randy had a comment or sort of question, some great findings. Many of these observations are not new to most fuels folks. Will there be any follow-up to assess if units have enacted any of the suggested next steps?
Yeah, so I mean, we are spending a lot of time trying to communicate these findings to leadership in the agencies and to partners on the ground. And I think it would take additional funding on our part to do some longitudinal work. So something we'll be looking for, and I would love your ideas about where to find that.
Catherine asked, did you find perceptions of policy barriers to be different between forested and rangeland management areas?
Yeah, I think specifically just because of fuel types and conditions. And so in the rangeland areas, that's where Sarah McCaffrey did a lot of our interviews in Nevada and Utah, for example, and heard a lot more about the challenges around cheatgrass and sage-grouse conservation, for example. But I think there were also these themes that were consistent across them. So, when I looked, for example, at the east and west side of Montana, we heard pretty similar themes. And one of the things that I think most people are really talking about is how to plan at larger scales and increase incentives. And that was a consistent theme across both types of ecosystems.
Rob had a comment. The USDA Office of General Counsel has a specific presentation regarding the lack of personal liability for Forest Service employees working within the scope of their employment.
Cool. Rob, can you send me that?
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Amy had a comment or a question. I've noticed in Utah that the national parks and monuments seem to be lagging behind in getting rid of the beetle-killed trees, given the horrible fire in Bryan Head last year. I would think that they would want to get rid of these. Do you have any comments or suggestions for that?
Yeah, sorry, that's outside of my area of expertise, and I don't want to speculate on that.
Fair enough. Managing wildfires like prescribed fires offer the best hope for getting, this is Timothy, commented, managing wildfires like prescribed fires offer the best hope for getting more fire on the ground in the near term. What policies are being considered to incentivize typically risk-averse managers to approve more ecological fire use on wildfires?
Yeah, at the national level, I think some of the things that, so right now there's just not a lot of appetite for legislation around fire and adding capacity given the fire funding fix. So there are those recommendations for increased categorical exclusions, which I'm not personally supportive of, and we could talk about why, but I do think maybe in a couple of years we could talk a little bit more about having dedicated funding that would work like both an incentive and a capacity building tool that could go to places that have a plan to get more work done. I've also heard the idea of doing more cost sharing with the states, so you could have more local capacity and that would be shared with the feds. I'm also hearing that regions are reorganizing where they invest positions for fuels organizations to places that have line officers and FMOs that are excited about burning and getting planning done. So I think there's some internal dynamics, and then there's consistently been some internal regional competitions for funding. I've seen those really since 2013, and I think they were probably around before that for a while too. So I think that's another kind of incentive that's out there. We did hear a fair bit that the agencies need more fire adapted line officers, and whether or not that's something that's kind of going into the calculus around leadership, I don't really know, but I think it's an interesting idea.
David had a question. Did participants talk about pay or compensation for prescribed fire operations? Does prescribed fire qualify for hazard and or overtime for federal employees? Did you get a sense as to whether or not that's impacting management decisions on the ground?
So yes, people talk about the fact that they can get more overtime and hazard pay if they leave their units and go work on wildland fires. And so people will say that's one reason they can't keep capacity around during prescribed fire when they want to do prescribed fire. But they'll also say, you know, well, the region or the dispatch centers want to hold resources to be available. And so, you know, there's a hot shot crew nearby, but I can't get them because of wildland fire. So specifically, I believe you do get overtime pay working on prescribed fire, but not hazard pay. And people told us it's not so much that it's about the pay, it's just about acknowledging the risk inherent in doing any fire work, and that not having hazard pay kind of devalues the work they're doing. So I think that's something to consider changing. I think it's 1:30, so we're going to need to sign off.
Yep.
I'm going to say
Go for it.
bye and thanks, and I hope people will be in touch via email or give me a call with me and Heidi. And Heidi's your point person if you're interested, particularly in stuff going on in the Northwest. And thanks everyone for joining us.
Courtney, we had a couple of people want to know if you would make your slideshow available. So if you're willing to share that with me, I'll post it on our website and then people can look at it if that's possible. So.
Yep, sounds great. Let me add a link to our reports and then I will send that to you.
Great. All right, everybody, we still have about 200 people on the call, so if you wouldn't mind taking our quick survey before you sign off, that would be really helpful. Again, if you're interested in our webinars, we have one more tomorrow on Emerald Ash Borer with Dan Herms from the Davey Tree Company. So that one will start at 12 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. I hope to see you there. And thank you for joining us today. And if we didn't address your question, I sure am sorry about that. We got through a whole bunch of them, over 26 questions. So I will provide a link to Heidi and Courtney's email. So if you want to ask them directly, I'm happy to do that. So thanks again for joining us. And I'm going to leave the poll open for a few more seconds. For those of you that are still on the call, please let us know how we're doing. And if you thought this webinar was a good, useful use of your time. Thank you so much.